The sun was a hammer in a bleached white sky. It beat down on the Arizona territory, on the hard-baked earth that cracked like old pottery, on the skeletal arms of the saguaro cacti reaching for a heaven that offered no relief. Heat shimmered in waves off the ground, making the distant, sharp-edged mesas tremble as if they were alive and in pain. The land was a vast and silent thing, a patient predator that could kill a man with sun or thirst or simple, crushing loneliness. It was brutal in its honesty and, in its own unforgiving way, beautiful. Elias Thorne was a man made of this same earth. At 42, his face was a map of dry riverbeds carved by sun and wind. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were sunk deep in his skull and held the permanent, weary squint of a man who had spent a lifetime staring into the glare. His hands, gripping a length of barbed wire with worn leather gloves, were gnarled and scarred, the hands of a man who spoke to the world through hard labor. He moved with a deliberate economy that wasted no motion, no breath, no thought. He was mending a fence on the far edge of his sprawling, isolated cattle ranch, the T-bar, with only his dun horse and the immense silence for company. He preferred it that way. The silence did not lie, and the horse did not ask questions. He worked with a rhythm born of long practice, stretch the wire, anchor it, hammer the staple. His thoughts were as sparse as the landscape, focused on the tautness of the wire, the solid bite of the staple into the cedar post. But beneath the surface of the task, a deep current of melancholy flowed, a quiet sadness that had been his companion for so long it felt like a part of his own skin. Then, a flicker of movement on the horizon. It was a small speck, a disruption in the seamless join of earth and sky. Elias stopped, the hammer still in his hand, his body instantly alert. Visitors were rare out here, and rarely were they good news. His gaze sharpened, tracking the speck as it grew slowly larger. A rider. His right hand fell, resting by instinct near the walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. It was a gesture as natural to him as breathing. He watched the rider approach, his squint tightening. He could make out the slump of their shoulders, a posture of bone-deep exhaustion, but there was a determination in the way they kept the horse moving forward, a straight and unwavering line across the shimmering plain. As the figure drew closer, the details resolved themselves. Not a man, a woman. A woman traveling alone in this country was either a fool or desperate. Elias figured she was likely both. She stopped her horse a dozen feet from him and dismounted. The animal was a tired-looking pinto, lathered with sweat and coated in a fine red dust. The woman herself looked little better. She was in her mid to late 20s, her face smudged with dirt, her riding skirt torn and faded, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that defied her weary state. Her features were a striking blend, her high cheekbones and straight black hair speaking of her Apache blood, but her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a knowledge of a world beyond the reservation. Those eyes settled on his face, searching him with an intensity that pricked at his defenses, a look so direct it felt like a trespass. "Elias Thorne," she said. Her voice was steady, without a trace of the tremor he expected from her exhaustion. It was not a question. He gave a single, curt nod, his face an unreadable mask of suspicion. He did not offer his name in return. She already had it. The question was how. She took a slow breath, her gaze never leaving his. "I have come to marry you." The words fell into the vast silence of the desert. Elias stared at her. The sun beat down. His horse stamped a hoof, jingling the harness. He felt a slow, rising tide of disbelief. She had to be mad. A runaway from an asylum, perhaps, or some poor girl who had spent too long in the sun. Or maybe this was a trick, some new scheme from a neighbor with an eye on his water rights. His voice, when it came, was rust rough. "Who in God's name are you?" She did not flinch from his harsh tone. "You saved me," she said simply. 20 years ago, you saved me from the soldiers at the Blue River." A name surfaced from a place deep within her memory, a child's name for a man she barely saw. "They called you Gray Eyes." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Gray eyes. It was a name he had not heard in 2 decades, a name he had buried under years of silence and hard work. The carefully constructed walls he had built around that memory, stone by painful stone, began to tremble. The fence, the sun, the present moment dissolved, and he was falling backward through time, into the smoke and the screaming. The year is 1865. He is younger, leaner, a man already hollowed out by grief. His wife, Sarah, and their infant son, Daniel, were taken by the cholera a year before. So swift and cruel it felt like a thief in the night. He had signed on as a scout for the U.S. cavalry to escape the suffocating silence of his empty home, to lose himself in the hard lines of the frontier. But he had not found escape, only a different kind of hell. He is part of a punitive expedition. That is what the major called it, a response to a raid on a freight wagon. But Elias knows better. He sees the encampment nestled in the canyon, the morning cook fires sending thin tendrils of smoke into the sky, hears the distant sound of children's laughter. This is not a war party. This is a village of old men, women, and children. Then the order is given, and the world erupts. The chaos is absolute, a sickening symphony of rifle shots echoing off the canyon walls, the thud of bullets hitting flesh, the high, thin screams of women. Smoke billows up, thick with the smell of gunpowder and something else, something coppery and hot that turns his stomach. It is not a battle. He has seen battles. This is a slaughter, as brutal and indiscriminate as a wolf in a sheep pen. He is horrified, a cold sickness spreading through his gut. He is a part of this. His presence, his silence, makes him complicit in the butchery. Something inside him snaps, some desperate, primal need to counterbalance the death he is helping to create. He breaks from his detail, his movements unseen in the swirling smoke and confusion. He is driven by an image, the ghost of his own son's face, small and pale in his cradle. He finds a small girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, huddled in a brushwood shelter, a wickiup. Her eyes are wide and black with terror, watching as her world is burned and shot to pieces around her. He does not think, he acts. The smell of blood is heavy in the air. He sees her silent trembling, the way she flinches when he reaches a hand toward her. He moves swiftly, clamping his hand over her mouth to muffle any sound she might make, pulling her small, shaking body against his. He hides her under his long duster coat, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her back. He smuggles her away from the carnage as the soldiers begin their grim work of looting the dead and setting fire to what remains of the village. For 3 days, he keeps her with him in the wilderness, a phantom moving through the canyons. He knows he cannot take her to a fort. There, she would be a prisoner, an object of scorn or worse. He cannot leave her to die. He finds out her name is Tuile. He shares his hardtack and jerky with her, gives her water from his canteen. He keeps her warm at night, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice, words she cannot understand but a tone that slowly, painstakingly, chips away at her terror. It is a brief, desperate act of penance for the son he could not save, a single flickering candle of a life held against a hurricane of death. On the second night, she is crying, a low, keening sound of fear and hunger and utter loss. He holds her, rocking her gently. She looks up at him, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the small fire, and speaks to him in her own tongue, a string of soft, urgent words. He does not understand. Later, he would ask another scout, a man who knew a little of the Apache tongue, what she might have said. The man shrugged. Sounds like she was making a promise, a child's promise. Sometimes, when they're scared, they promise the ultimate thing, a lifetime of loyalty. Promise to be your wife if you protect them. Elias had dismissed it then, the fancy of a terrified child. But the moment, the sound of her small voice making a sacred vow, stuck in his memory like a burr. The separation is the hardest part. He knows he cannot keep her. He is a white man, a scout for the army that just destroyed her people. To keep her would be to condemn them both. He rides south, across the border, and leaves her near a small, sun-bleached mission. He believes it is the safest place he can find. a place where the priests might show her kindness, where she might have a chance to survive. Before he goes, he presses a small object into her hand. It is a bird, carved from a piece of cottonwood, its wings outstretched, a toy he had once whittled for his son, Daniel. During long nights by a campfire, he shoves it into her hand, turns his horse, and rides away without looking back. Leaving her there feels like a second, deeper failure, another life he has failed to protect. He spends the next 20 years trying to bury the memory of her face under dust and silence. The past dissolves, and he is back in the blinding glare of the present. The woman, Naylin, is watching him, her dark eyes seeing the storm of memories that just passed through him, as if she knows what he is thinking, what he needs to see. She reaches into a small leather pouch at her belt. She pulls out a worn, smoothed piece of wood. It is the bird. The carving is dark with age and the oils of a hand that has held it for 2 decades. The lines are softened, the sharp edges gone, but it is unmistakably the same. The sight of it is like a key turning a lock deep inside him, opening a door to a room he had sealed shut forever. The proof is absolute. His reaction is not joy, it is not relief, it is a sudden, violent surge of anger. Anger that this ghost has returned, that this wound he thought had scarred over has been ripped open again. "Get on your horse," he says, his voice a low growl, "and leave." She looks from the bird in her hand to his face, her expression unwavering. "The past is dead," he snarls, taking a step toward her. "You should have left it buried. That man, the one you remember, he is not here. He died a long time ago." Naylin stands her ground. There is a strength in her that surprises him, a resilience forged in a fire he cannot imagine. "The mission was not safe," she says, her voice still quiet, but now laced with the iron of her will. "Not long after you left, bandits came. They burned it. I was found by a family, a kind man and woman from a village in Mexico. They gave me my name, Naylin. They raised me as their own." She pauses, her eyes clouding with a different, more recent memory of pain. "They died last year. The fever took them both. They did not have much, but they left me what they had. It was enough for a horse and supplies. It took me almost a year to find you. I followed stories of a solitary rancher with gray eyes, a man who kept to himself. I followed them all the way here." She looks at him, and he sees the child's promise reflected in the woman's eyes. No longer a fancy, but the pole star of her entire existence. "I came to honor my vow." Elias lets out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A vow! You were a child. You did not know what you were saying." He gestures wildly at the unforgiving landscape around them. "Look at this place. Look at me. What life do you think is here for you? The world is no safer for an Apache woman now than it was 20 years ago. My neighbors are hard men, men who fought in the wars, men who lost brothers and sons. Do you know what they will do when they see you here? Your presence on my land would be a death sentence for you, and it would bring ruin on me." He spits the words at her, trying to make them as cruel and sharp as possible, trying to frighten her away for her own good, to save her from the mistake of coming here. She listens to his tirade, her face impassive, absorbing the hatefulness of his words. When he is finished, breathing hard in the silence, she looks straight into his soul. "I am not afraid of hard men," she says, her voice ringing with a simple, profound sincerity that cuts through his bitter cynicism. "Death has walked beside me my whole life. Prejudice is the air I have always breathed. The only thing I have ever feared is a life spent alone, without the one person who gave me my life back." The standoff stretches, thick and heavy in the late afternoon heat. He is a stone wall, and she is the persistent water that will, in time, wear it down. He sees it in her eyes. He is trapped. "I told you to leave," he says again, his voice raw now, stripped of its anger and left with only a ragged desperation. "This is my land. I want you gone." For the first time, Naylin moves. She shakes her head, a small, resolute gesture. Then she turns to her tired pinto, reaches for the cinch, and begins to unsaddle it. The message is clear. She is not leaving. The sun begins its slow descent, kissing the tops of the distant mesas. Long, dramatic shadows stretch across the land like dark fingers. Elias Thorne stands frozen, staring at this impossible woman who has ridden out of a past he spent 2 decades trying to kill. She is a living piece of his own history, a history he despises, and she has just declared herself the architect of his future. He feels cornered, furious, and shaken to the very core of his desolate soul. The dawn broke cold and sharp over the eastern mesas, the sky a pale, bruised purple that offered little promise of warmth. Elias emerged from the Spartan gloom of his ranch house, his mood as dark and volatile as a gathering storm. He had slept poorly, tormented by ghosts he thought long buried. He expected the desert to be empty, for the woman to have come to her senses and fled in the night. But she was there. She had made a small, neat camp near the barn where she had clearly spent the night. A thin curl of smoke rose from a fire, and the rich, bracing scent of coffee cut through the crisp morning air. She was tending to her horse, her movements efficient and capable, her hands gentle on the animal's flank. When she saw him, she straightened. She walked to the fire, poured the steaming black liquid into a tin cup, and held it out to him. She did not speak. The gesture was both an offering of peace and an unyielding statement of her intent to stay. Elias ignored it. He stalked toward her, his face a granite mask of fury. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice a low growl that was more dangerous than a shout. She did not pull the cup back, her hand remaining steady. His anger, fueled by a sleepless night and a lifetime of solitude, boiled over. "There is nothing for you here," he snarled. "I have no food to spare, no room in my house. There is no place for a woman on this ranch, and especially not for an Apache woman." He used the words deliberately, like stones, wanting them to bruise her, to make her turn and run from the ugliness he knew the world would show her. A flicker of pain crossed her features, a brief shadow in the depths of her dark eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Her expression settled into one of unbroken resolve. She finally lowered the cup, setting it carefully on a rock near the fire. "I am not asking for charity, Elias Thorne," she said, her voice even. She met his glare without flinching. "I am asking for a chance to earn my place." She gestured toward his house, a stark silhouette against the rising sun. "Your clothes are torn. There is dust on every surface of your home. The garden patch your wife must have planted is choked with weeds." She looked back at him. "I can cook, I can clean. I can mend your clothes and bring that garden back to life. I am not a fragile girl to be sheltered. I am a survivor. I have skills. I can be of use to you." Her pragmatism caught him off guard. He had been prepared for tears, for pleas, for the kind of feminine hysterics he had no patience for. He was not prepared for a practical assessment of his domestic failings. It was infuriating. It was also undeniably true. He scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "A woman's work," he spat. "That is not what this place requires. The real work here is breaking wild horses and branding cattle. It is a man's world." It was a weak argument, a desperate attempt to cling to his authority, and they both knew it. To his utter astonishment, Nylund turned and walked toward the corral. Inside, a half-wild Mustang, a powerful buckskin he had been struggling with for weeks, paced nervously. The horse was mean and unpredictable, and had thrown him twice. "Stay away from that horse," he commanded. She paid him no mind. Before he could move to stop her, she slipped between the wooden rails of the corral. The Mustang shied, its eyes rolling, its ears flattening against its head. Elias tensed, ready to vault the fence to pull her from beneath the animal's lashing hooves. But Nylund did not approach it head-on. She stood near the fence, perfectly still, and began to speak. Her voice was a low, calm murmur, a mix of the soft Spanish she had grown up with and other words, guttural and melodic, that he could only assume were Apache. The effect was instantaneous and baffling. The horse stopped its frantic pacing, its ears swiveled, then relaxed. It took a hesitant step toward her, then another, its neck outstretched as it sniffed the air. She did not try to touch it at first, simply continuing her soft monologue. After a long moment, she slowly extended a hand. The horse flinched, but did not bolt. It allowed her to stroke its neck, its powerful muscles quivering but submitting to her touch. Elias stood outside the corral, watching in a state of warring fury and a grudging, undeniable respect. The day unfolded in a tense, suffocating silence. Nalan did exactly as she had promised. She set to work on his neglected home with a quiet, methodical purpose that was both an invasion and a strange sort of blessing. She swept the floors, scrubbed the grime from the kitchen table, and organized his meager supplies of flour and beans. He tried to ignore her, busying himself with the harshest chores he could find on the far side of the ranch. He repaired a section of fence, cleared rocks from a dry creek bed, worked himself until his muscles burned and sweat dripped from his brow, but he could not escape the awareness of her. Her presence was a subtle shift in the very air of his world, a quiet rearranging of the lonely universe he had so carefully constructed. He did not understand her, and he did not want to, but she understood herself. Nalan was not driven by a young girl's romantic fantasy. Her life had been a long, hard lesson in survival. The Mexican family who had taken her in had been kind, but they had been poor, and she had always been an outsider in their small village. The other children, with the thoughtless cruelty of their age, had whispered and pointed. She was the dark-skinned girl, the orphan, the Apache. She had been loved, but she had never truly belonged. Elias Thorne was the one anchor point in the turbulent waters of her life. The memory of the gray-eyed man who had plucked her from the heart of a nightmare was not just a memory. It was the foundation upon which she had built her identity. He represented the one moment of profound, selfless kindness she had ever known. Her journey to find him, her declaration to marry him, was not about passion. It was a quest for a home, for a place to belong, a way to honor the sacred debt she felt she owed him. She knew that love, if it was to ever grow between them, could not be built on a child's promise. It had to be forged in the fire of mutual respect and shared survival. She would earn her place here, or she would die trying. A few days later, his supplies running low, Elias had no choice but to ride into the nearby town of Redemption. Redemption was a single, dusty street lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a stark white church, all baking under the relentless sun. The town was populated by people hardened by that same sun, their faces weathered, their eyes holding the same wary suspicion as his own. But where Elias's isolation had given him a certain depth, theirs had curdled into a gossipy, judgmental prejudice. The town's most powerful citizen was a rival rancher named Jedediah Kane. Kane was a man of large appetites and a small soul, everything Elias was not. He was outwardly charming, with a politician's smile and a firm handshake, but inwardly he was rotten with a greed that drove him to acquire land and power by any means necessary. He controlled the town's water rights, a stranglehold he used to bully smaller ranchers into selling out to him. He and Elias had a long-standing animosity, born from a bitter dispute over a shared property line and a fundamental difference in their characters. Elias saw Kane as a vulture. Kane saw Elias as a stubborn fool sitting on land he coveted. Kane spotted him in the general store, his smile wide and false. "Elias, good to see you've come down from that mountain of yours. A man can go sour, all that time alone." He clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Still trying to scratch a living out of that rock pile. I've made you a fair offer for it more than once. You should consider it." The conversation was a familiar dance, Kane's genial words dripping with veiled threats. "My living is my own business, Kane," Elias said, his voice flat, "and my land is not for sale." Across the store, the sheriff, a weak-willed man named Blevins with a drooping mustache and nervous eyes, watched them. He was effectively in Kane's pocket, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, wishing he were anywhere else. On the ride back to the T-bar, the animosity took a more physical form. As he guided his horse down a narrow, rocky trail, the animal suddenly screamed and stumbled, its front legs tangling in something he could not see. He was thrown hard, his shoulder smashing against a boulder with a sickening crack of bone. He lay on the ground, gasping for breath, pain exploding in his arm. When his vision cleared, he saw it. A single strand of wire, strung taut between two trees, almost invisible in the afternoon shadows. It was not a direct attack. It was sabotage, a message. He knew, with a certainty that settled cold and hard in his gut, that it was Cain's men. He arrived back at the ranch well after nightfall, exhausted, bruised, and cradling his injured arm. A single lamp was lit in the window of the house, a small beacon of light in the vast darkness. Naylin was waiting for him. She came out onto the porch as he clumsily dismounted, and her eyes immediately went to his arm, to the pain etched on his face. "You are hurt," she stated, her voice full of a concern that cut through his defenses. She immediately took charge. Before he could protest, she was guiding him inside, helping him into a chair. Her touch was gentle but firm as she cut away the sleeve of his shirt. He resisted at first, the instinct to refuse help, to refuse care, deeply ingrained. But the pain was a grinding, relentless thing, and he was too weak to fight her for long. She cleaned the scrapes on his face and arms with a damp cloth. Then, with a skill that surprised him, she examined his shoulder. She worked with an expert touch, her fingers probing gently until she found the dislocation. With a swift, sure movement, she set the bone back into its socket. The pain was sharp and blinding, but it was followed by a wave of relief. She fashioned a sling from a clean strip of cotton, her movements efficient and practiced. As she worked, standing so close to him in the warm lamplight, the dynamic between them shifted. The physical proximity created a new level of intimacy. He could smell the faint scent of sage that clung to her skin and hair. He saw the genuine worry in her eyes, an emotion no one had shown for him in 20 years. For the first time, he did not see a ghost from his past or a problem to be solved. He saw a warm, living, breathing woman. And deep within him, in a place he thought had long since turned to dust, a flicker of desire, long dormant, stirred to life. Over the next few days, with his arm in the sling, Elias was forced to rely on her. Naylin proved her worth tenfold. She managed the house effortlessly, but she did more than that. She helped with the ranch chores he could no longer manage, showing a surprising knowledge of livestock and land. She worked from before sunrise to after sunset, never complaining, her quiet competence a constant, humbling presence. During this time, they began to talk. The conversations were stilted at first, focused on the practical matters of the ranch, but slowly, cautiously, they began to share small pieces of their lives. He learned about the poor but loving family that had raised her, of the simple joys and constant sorrows of being an outsider. She, in turn, learned about the harsh realities of his life, the constant fight against drought, against predators, against the greed of men like Jedediah Cain. One evening, a summer storm rolled in, the sky turning a dark, bruised gray. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the small ranch house, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder. Naylin, who had been mending one of his shirts by the fire, went rigid. She became utterly still, her face pale, her eyes wide and staring at nothing. Elias watched her, a knot of concern tightening in his chest. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She trembled, her voice a near whisper. "The flashes," she said, not looking at him. "They look like the flashes from the soldiers' rifles." The shared trauma, the ghost that had stood between them, suddenly opened a door, seeing her so vulnerable, so lost in that terrible memory. A powerful, protective instinct rose in him. He moved to sit beside her, his good arm coming to rest on her shoulder. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell her it was in the past. He offered her the only comfort he had. "The fever," he said, his own voice choked and raw. "It took my wife and son. It was so fast. One day they were fine. The next they were burning with it. I did not even get a chance to say goodbye." I just held my boy's hand until it went cold. It was a confession he had never made to another living soul, a piece of his own shattered heart that he had kept locked away in darkness. He had shared it with her. The raw, terrible honesty of that moment created an unbreakable bond between them. In that small, storm-tossed house, they were no longer a rancher and an Apache woman. They were two lonely, wounded people who had found a strange and unexpected solace in each other's presence. The romantic tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for days became a palpable, living thing in the air between them. The storm passed, but the world outside remained hostile. A few days later, Cain's men escalated their campaign of intimidation. Elias found one of his prized calves lying dead near his well, its throat cut. It was a cruel, wasteful act designed to hurt him. Lying in the dust next to the carcass was a single, crudely made arrow, fletched with the feathers of a hawk, an Apache arrow. It was a clear, vicious attempt to frame Nayland, to use the town's simmering prejudice as a weapon against them both. Elias stared at the arrow, then at the dead animal. Nayland had followed him to the well and stood a few feet away, her face a mask of horror. For a single, terrible moment, an old, ingrained suspicion flickered in Elias's eyes. He looked at her, and in that instant, she saw the doubt. The possibility that he might actually believe her capable of such a thing was a more devastating blow than any insult. But the flicker died as quickly as it had appeared. His jaw tightened. He reached down and pulled the arrow from the ground. Without a word, he put it over his knee and snapped it in two. He tossed the broken pieces into a nearby fire pit. Then he turned and looked at her, his gray eyes blazing with a cold, protective fire she had never seen before. "They will not have you," he said. It was not a promise. It was a vow. The first time he had truly claimed her as his, a declaration of their alliance against the world. The snapping of the arrow was a sound that broke more than just the wood. In the tense silence that followed, something shifted between Elias and Nayland, a silent acknowledgement that his fight was now her fight, and hers was his. They were no longer two separate, wary individuals occupying the same space. They were a unit, a fortress of two against a hostile world. The atmosphere on the T-Bar Ranch transformed. The cautious coexistence gave way to a fragile, burgeoning partnership, born not of affection, but of a shared and looming danger. Recognizing that her life depended on more than just his protection, Elias began to teach her how to shoot. He brought out his Winchester rifle, its steel barrel cool and heavy in her hands. The lessons were practical, born of a grim necessity, but they became something else entirely. He would stand behind her, his body a solid presence against her back, his arms coming around hers to correct her stance. "Hold it firm against your shoulder," he would say, his voice a low, steady murmur in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Don't fight the kick. Become part of the gun." The physical contact was an electric current that passed between them, charged with an unspoken desire that neither dared to name. He was all hard angles and weathered strength, smelling of leather, sun, and gun oil. She was soft and resilient, smelling of sage and the desert rain. In those moments, with the report of the rifle echoing off the distant mesas, they were closer than they had ever been, speaking a language of survival that was more intimate than any whispered endearment. He taught her the heft and balance of the Colt as well, how to draw, aim, and fire in a smooth, economical motion, the same way he moved, the same way he lived. Nayland, in turn, began to share her own knowledge, the deep and ancient wisdom of the land that flowed in her blood. She walked the arid landscape with him, pointing out the plants he had always seen as worthless scrub. "This one," she would say, holding up a dusty green leaf, "you can boil the root for a fever, and this one, the berries are poison, but the inner bark, when made into a paste, will draw the venom from a snake bite." It was knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in a place where the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride away. She taught him how to track, not just the obvious signs of a broken twig or a hoof print, but the subtle language of the earth. She showed him how the morning dew settled on a track to tell its age, how a displaced pebble could reveal the direction and speed of a passing animal. She taught him to read the land in a way he never had, despite living on it for decades. Their shared lessons became a quiet courtship, a conversation held not in words, but in the essential skills of staying alive. A mutual respect grew, and from that hard, fertile ground, something that felt perilously like love began to blossom. The emotional walls between them, however, were still standing, weathered and high. One night, as they sat by the fire in the small, quiet house, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, Nayland broke the comfortable silence. "Tell me about your wife," she asked, her voice soft. Elias froze, a piece of wood halfway to the fire. The memory of Sarah was a raw, private wound, a place in his soul he never visited. He wanted to tell Nayland it was none of her business, to retreat back into the silence that had been his only confidant for so long. But he looked at her, at the patient, empathetic calm in her eyes, and the words, rusty from disuse, began to come. He spoke of Sarah, of her laughter that sounded like water over stones, of the way she could make wildflowers grow in the unforgiving soil next to the porch. He spoke of their infant son, Daniel, of his small, perfect hands and the fierce, impossible love he had felt for him. He described the crushing, helpless grief that had hollowed him out when the cholera took them, leaving him a shell of a man, wandering in a world that had lost all its color. Then, his voice thick with an emotion that still had the power to strangle him, he confessed the rest. "When I found you," he said, staring into the fire, "in that camp, saving you, it was the first thing that made me feel human again, the first thing that was not about death." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a profound, 20-year-old pain. "But leaving you at that mission, it felt like I was failing all over again. Another life I could not protect. I rode away and tried to forget you ever existed. It was easier than living with the shame of it." Nayland listened, her empathy a palpable presence in the room, absorbing his pain without judgment. When the silence stretched and his confession hung in the air between them, she gave him a piece of her own shattered heart in return. "My adoptive parents were kind," she began, her voice a quiet murmur. "I loved them, but I was never one of them. In the village, the other children had names for me. They would not play with me. I was the outsider, the savage." She looked down at her hands. "I felt like a ghost, caught between a world I could not remember and a world that would not have me. So I held on to the one memory I had, the stone man with gray eyes." She looked up, and he saw the fierce, unwavering loyalty of the child she had been, now forged into the unbreakable will of the woman she had become. "That memory was not just a memory, Elias. It became a story I told myself, a myth. It was my hope that somewhere in this world there was one person who had been kind, and that if I could find him, I would finally find a place where I belonged." The exchange stripped away every last pretense between them. They were no longer the rescuer and the rescued, the rancher and the Apache girl. They were two profoundly lonely souls, scarred by the world in different ways, who had finally, impossibly, found their other half in the vast, empty wilderness. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken emotions, with 20 years of pain and longing and hope. Elias reached out, his movements slow, almost hesitant. He gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The gesture was filled with a reverence and a tenderness that made her tremble. He leaned in, his gaze searching hers, and then he kissed her. The kiss was not explosive or passionate, not at first. It was hesitant, questioning, a soft and deeply emotional meeting of lips that tasted of salt and sorrow. It was the culmination of a child's desperate promise and a man's lonely penance. Then, as the reality of it, the warmth and the life of it, flooded through them, the kiss deepened. It became more desperate, hungry, as 2 decades of carefully maintained barriers shattered into dust. and they clung to each other as if they were the only two people left in the world. Their romance, now openly acknowledged, brought a period of quiet, fragile joy to the ranch. There were small moments of happiness that felt enormous in the context of their lonely lives. They laughed together, a loud, unburdened sound, as they worked to repair a stubborn water pump, both of them getting soaked in the process. At dinner, their hands would brush as they both reached for the bread, a simple touch that sent a jolt through them both. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun set the sky on fire, their silence no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable intimacy more profound than any words. For the first time in 20 years, Elias's house felt like a home. He even found himself smiling. An action so foreign it made the muscles in his face feel rusty and strange. But their small sanctuary of peace was an island in a growing sea of ugliness. In the town of Redemption, Jedediah Cain was furious. His attempts to intimidate Elias had not only failed, they had seemingly pushed the stubborn rancher and the Apache woman closer together. Cain decided to escalate his campaign, shifting his weapon from physical threats to the more insidious poison of words. He began to spread vicious rumors in the saloon, in the general store, wherever men gathered. He spoke of Nalan as a savage, a dark influence who had used some kind of witchcraft to bewitch the grieving Elias Thorne in order to steal his ranch. He hinted that she was a scout for a renegade Apache war party that was hiding in the hills, waiting for a chance to descend on the good people of Redemption. The seeds of fear and racism, planted in the fertile ground of the townspeople's ignorance, took root and began to grow. The tension came to a head on a hot, dusty afternoon. The general store was robbed. The storekeeper, a nervous man named Abernathy, was knocked unconscious, and a small amount of cash and goods were taken. It was the kind of desperate, clumsy crime that was not uncommon on the frontier. But Jedediah Cain saw his opportunity. Later that day, after the sheriff had come and gone, Cain returned to the store to offer his condolences to Abernathy, and there, tucked behind a sack of flour, he found a piece of evidence, a distinctive beaded bracelet, one that several people had seen Nalan wearing on her last trip to town. He presented it to the suggestible Sheriff Blevins, his face a mask of grave concern, and painted a picture of a dangerous savage growing bolder, moving from petty theft to violent assault. That night, Cain gathered a posse. It was not a group of lawmen, but a mob of drunken, fearful townsmen, their courage bolstered by cheap whiskey and their worst instincts inflamed by Cain's manipulative words. He stood on a crate outside the saloon, his voice ringing out in the torchlight. He told them that Elias Thorne was harboring a dangerous criminal, an Apache who would bring nothing but death and destruction down on all of them. He framed it not as a land grab, but as a matter of justice, of protecting their homes and families. Only one man spoke out against the rising tide of hate. Silas Croft was an old, grizzled ranch hand who worked a small plot of land that bordered the T-bar. He had known Elias for 30 years, had known him when his face was unlined and his life was full of laughter. He was a quiet, fiercely loyal man, and he was perhaps the only true friend Elias had left in the world. He stood at the back of the crowd, listening to Cain's poison with a growing sense of dread. He knew Cain for the snake he was, and he knew Elias. He slipped away from the mob, saddled his horse, and rode out into the night, his heart pounding with a desperate urgency. He arrived at the T-Bar Ranch like a whirlwind, his horse lathered, his face pale in the moonlight. He found Elias and Nalan on the porch and told them, his words tumbling out in a breathless rush, that a lynch mob was on its way. Elias's reaction was not panic, but a sudden, terrifying coldness. A deadly calm settled over him. "Silas, you need to get out of here," he said, his voice flat and hard. "This is not your fight." The old man shook his head, his jaw set stubbornly. "I ain't leaving you to face this alone, Elias. Not now, not ever." There was no more time for argument. They worked quickly, barricading the door with a heavy oak table, shutting and barring the windows. Nalan, though her hands trembled, showed incredible courage. She moved with a quiet efficiency, loading the Winchester and Elias's spare rifles, her face a pale but determined mask. The posse arrived at dusk, a collection of shadowy figures on horseback, their faces a grotesque collage of anger and fear in the flickering torchlight. Cain rode to the front, positioning himself just outside of rifle range. "Thorn!" he shouted, his voice dripping with false authority. "We know you have the Apache witch in there. Send her out, and we will let you be." Elias's voice rang out from a darkened window, as sharp and cold as breaking glass. "You are cowards and fools, Cain, every last one of you. You let this greedy snake lead you by the nose to do his dirty work for him. There is no one here but honest folk. Now get off my land." For a moment, there was a tense silence. Then Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Have it your way, Thorn," he roared, and raised his arm. "Burn them out!" The first volley of gunfire erupted, a deafening roar that shattered the windows of the ranch house and splintered the wooden walls. The siege had begun. Elias, Nayland, and Silas returned fire, using their knowledge of the house for cover. The gunfight was chaotic and brutal, the night air filled with the flash of muzzles, the whine of ricocheting bullets, and the drunken shouts of the mob. During a lull in the fighting, as the posse reloaded, Silas moved to a side window, trying to get a clear shot at a group of men hiding behind the water trough. He peered around the edge of the window frame. Taking aim, he exposed himself for a fraction of a second too long. A single rifle shot cracked through the night, sharper and louder than the others. Silas was thrown backward as if by an invisible fist, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed to the floor with a heavy final sound. Elias rushed to his side, his heart seizing with a cold, terrible dread. He knelt and turned his friend over. Silas's eyes were already glazing over, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked up at Elias, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "Protect the girl, Elias," he choked out, his last breath a bloody whisper, and then he was gone. The death of his oldest and only friend was a devastating, soul-shattering blow. The grief and rage that filled Elias was an immense and terrifying force, a tidal wave of black fury that washed away everything else. He looked over at Nayland, her face pale with horror, her hands pressed to her mouth. In that moment, something inside him hardened, calcifying into pure, unbreakable resolve. The world had taken everything from him once before, his wife, his son, and now, his friend. He would burn the whole world to the ground before he let it take anything else. He laid Silas's head down gently, the sound of the posse's jeering and the renewed crackle of gunfire outside fading to a dull roar in his ears. The glimmer of hope and love he had found with Nayland was now drowned in a river of blood. This was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for vengeance. It was a final, bloody stand against the hatred that had pursued them all their lives. The world outside the ranch house was a cacophony of gunfire, drunken shouts, and the hungry roar of flames. But inside, a cold, terrible silence had fallen. For Elias, the noise of the siege faded to a dull, distant thunder. All he could hear was the echo of Silas's last, ragged breath. He knelt on the floorboards, the body of his only friend cradled in his arms, with movements that were stark and mechanical, as if he were a machine made of grief. He gently laid Silas down, folding the old man's hands on his chest. Nayland watched him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, but it was momentarily eclipsed by the profound, silent agony she saw in him. This was a man who had wrapped himself in solitude to protect what was left of his heart. And she had watched that heart be torn open once more. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. He flinched, a sharp, violent tremor, not from her touch, but from the raw, exposed nerve of his pain. He looked up, and his eyes were no longer the color of a stormy sky. They were like chips of flint, hard and gray and burning with a cold fire that chilled her to the bone. The tragedy had not broken him. It had galvanized him. It had burned away any last trace of hesitation, of fear, of the weary man who just wanted to be left alone. The siege raged on. Emboldened by their successful shot and fueled by Cain's whiskey, the mob grew more reckless. A flaming torch sailed through the air in a high arc and landed on the dry roof of the barn. Within moments, the structure that had been the center of Elias's life, the symbol of his 30 years of hard labor, was engulfed in flames. Orange and yellow light pulsed against the windows of the house, the fire leaping into the night sky like a terrible, beautiful beast. Elias watched it burn, his face impassive. Another blow, another loss. He and Nayland were trapped, surrounded, with the acrid smell of smoke beginning to seep through the walls. Their world had shrunk to the 4 bullet-riddled walls of this small wooden house. Death felt not only possible, but inevitable. It was in this desperate, claustrophobic crucible, with the world burning outside and a dead friend lying on the floor, that all pretenses between them were finally burned away. During a lull in the shooting, as they crouched below a shattered window, Elias turned to her. His face, illuminated by the flickering, hellish light of the burning barn, was a mask of raw emotion. "I was wrong," he said, his voice a rasp, thick with a grief and a sincerity that tore at her heart. "I was wrong to push you away. I was a fool to be afraid." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw a vulnerability in his flinty eyes that he had never shown before. "In the short time you have been here, you have brought more life back into me than I have felt in 20 years. You walked out of the past and made me feel like a living man again." He took a ragged breath, the confession torn from the deepest part of his soul. "I love you, Nayland. I think I have from the moment you rode back into my life." Tears she did not know she had been holding back streamed down Nayland's face, tracing clean paths through the grime and smoke on her cheeks. "I did not come back just to fulfill a child's promise," she answered, her voice a fierce, broken whisper. "I came back because the memory of your kindness was the only true thing I had to hold on to in my entire life. I came back looking for a home, and I found it. It was never this ranch or this land." She reached out, her hand finding his. "It was you, Elias. It was always you." Her grip tightened, her words a sacred vow in the face of their own annihilation. "I love you, Elias. If we die tonight, we die together, as husband and wife." The declaration hung in the air between them, profound and desperate and utterly sincere. It was a wedding vow made not in a church, but in a war zone, sealed not with a ring, but with the certainty of imminent death. And in that moment, with the roar of the fire and the shouts of the mob as their only witnesses, they sealed that vow. He pulled her to him, and their mouths met in a kiss that was not gentle or tender, but a fierce, almost violent affirmation of life. It was a desperate claiming of each other, a primal act of defiance against the darkness that was trying to consume them. On the rough-spun blankets on the floor of the main room, while the world outside burned, they came together. It was a stark and beautiful collision of two souls who had found each other at the edge of the abyss, a moment of pure, defiant existence that pushed back against the encroaching night. Afterward, as they lay together, their bodies slick with sweat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, a strange calm settled over Elias. The rage was still there, a hot coal deep in his belly, but it was no longer a wild, uncontrolled fire. It had been banked, focused, honed into a sharp and deadly point. He was no longer just reacting, he was thinking. He knew Jedediah Cain's weakness, his arrogance. Cain believed he had already won, and Elias knew his own strength. He knew every rock, every ditch, every shadow of this land. He had a plan, a desperate, clever plan. "There is a way out," he whispered, his voice low and urgent against her ear. He told her about an old, dry well behind the house, near the edge of a rocky ravine. Years ago, he had dug a narrow irrigation culvert from the bottom of it, a pipe of stone and earth that ran for 100 yards underground before emerging in the ravine. It would be a tight, suffocating squeeze, but it was their only chance. Under the cover of the thickest smoke, they made their escape. He prized open a back window that was shielded from the main force of the posse. They slipped out into the night, staying low, the heat from the burning barn scorching their skin. They reached the well, its wooden cover nearly hidden by overgrown brush. Elias lifted it, The blackness inside was absolute. He lowered Nalin down first, her feet finding the rough-hewn holds he had carved into the sides decades ago. He handed her the rifles, then followed, pulling the heavy wooden cover back into place above them, plunging them into a tomb-like darkness. They found the opening to the culvert at the bottom. The journey was terrifying. They crawled on their hands and knees through the suffocatingly narrow, pitch-black passage. The air was stale and thick with the smell of damp earth. It was a symbolic rebirth, a crawl through the grave and out the other side. Above them, they could hear the muffled shouts of the men and feel the vibrations of their heavy boots on the ground. They emerged at the other end, in the deep shadows of the ravine, gasping for fresh air, their clothes and skin caked in dirt. The fire from the barn cast an eerie, dancing glow over the entire landscape. From their new vantage point, hidden in the rocks, they could see the posse silhouetted against the flames. Their attention was focused entirely on the house, their figures black and menacing against the fire, believing their quarry was still trapped inside, waiting to be roasted alive. The tables had turned. Elias was no longer the besieged, he was the hunter. Using the stealth and tracking skills Nalin had taught him, combined with his own intimate knowledge of the terrain, they circled around the unsuspecting posse. He became a ghost in the darkness, a force of vengeance born from grief. They worked as a team, a silent, deadly partnership. Nalin positioned herself on a rocky outcrop to the west, while Elias crept through the brush to the east. Nalin fired first, a single shot from the Winchester, aimed not at a man but at the metal water trough, which rang out like a church bell in the night. The sound, coming from an unexpected direction, threw the mob into confusion. As they turned to fire wildly into the western darkness, Elias opened up from the east. He did not shoot to kill. He was not a murderer. He shot to disable, to terrify. His first bullet took a man in the thigh, sending him screaming to the ground. His second shattered the shoulder of another. He moved like a phantom, firing from one position, then melting back into the shadows to reappear in another. The terror of an unseen expert enemy was more effective than a dozen guns. The drunken courage of the mob evaporated, replaced by a panicked, superstitious fear. They were no longer a hunting party. They were the prey. The rout was swift and total, with men scrambling for their horses and fleeing into the darkness, wanting no more part of the ghost of the T-Bar Ranch. This left only Jedediah Kane. He stood alone amidst the smoldering ruins of the barn, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The final showdown was personal. It was not a classic quick-draw duel in the middle of a dusty street. It was a gritty, desperate fight between two men, fueled by hate and grief. Elias emerged from the shadows, his face hard and unforgiving in the dying firelight. Kane, realizing he was cornered, drew his pistol, but Kane was a bully, a man who paid others to do his fighting, and Elias was a man consumed by a righteous fury. Elias charged him, knocking the gun from Kane's hand before he could fire. They crashed to the ground, trading blows in the dirt and ash. It was a brutal, exhausting brawl. Elias fought with a cold, precise rage, each punch landing with the weight of his loss. Kane fought with the wild panic of a trapped animal. The fight ended with Elias on top of him, his hands around Kane's throat, his Colt peacemaker pressed hard against the man's temple. Kane, his arrogance completely gone, whimpered and begged for his life, his eyes wide with terror. It was at that moment that a different group of riders appeared, drawn by the fire and the prolonged gunfire. It was Sheriff Blevins, and with him, a handful of the more decent men from town, their faces grim and shocked by the scene of devastation before them. They saw it all, the burned-out shell of the barn, the bullet-riddled house, Elias, his face a mask of vengeance, and Kane, a pathetic, sniveling coward in the dirt. Then they saw Nalin, who had managed to drag Silas's body from the house, a silent, powerful testament to the night's terrible violence. Elias looked at the terrified man beneath him, every fiber of his being screaming for him to pull the trigger, to send this man to hell for what he had done. But as he looked into Kane's pathetic eyes, he saw that killing him would be an empty victory. It would make him no better than the men he despised. He holstered his pistol and stood up. Pulling Cain to his feet by the collar, he looked at the shamed face of Sheriff Blevins and the horrified onlookers. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it dripped with a cold, righteous contempt that cut through the silence. "This is the man you follow," Elias said, shoving Cain forward. "This is the pillar of your community. He tried to steal my land. He tried to murder this woman. And he put a bullet in the back of the best man I have ever known." He pointed to Silas's body. "He manipulated you. He lied to you. And he used your fear to do his dirty work. Look at him. This is your justice." Nalin stood beside Elias, no longer a victim, but a survivor, her presence more powerful than any words. The first pale light of dawn began to break over the smoking, devastated ranch. Sheriff Blevins, his face a mixture of shame and a newfound resolve, stepped forward and took Cain by the arm, the metal click of the handcuffs loud in the morning air. Victory had been achieved, but as Elias looked at the ruins of his life's work and the body of his dearest friend, it felt exactly like defeat. The pale, merciless light of dawn crept over the ravaged landscape, revealing the full extent of the night's devastation. The barn, which had stood for 30 years as a testament to Elias's labor, was now a great, black heap of smoldering timbers, hissing and popping as the morning air cooled the embers. The ranch house, their fortress, was brutally scarred, its windows blown out like vacant eyes, its walls pockmarked with the ugly scars of 100 bullet holes. Wrapped in a simple woolen blanket on the porch lay the still form of Silas Croft. The air, usually clean and sharp with the scent of dust and sage, was thick and heavy with the acrid smell of smoke and the metallic tang of death. The wild adrenaline of the fight had long since faded, draining away to leave both Elias and Nalin with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was more than a weariness of the body. It was a hollowing out of the soul, an emptiness that ached more than any physical wound. Sheriff Blevins, his face a mask of profound shame and regret, approached them as they stood silently surveying the ruins. With him were the half-dozen men from town who had not been part of Cain's mob. There were no grand apologies offered, for they all knew that words were a cheap and worthless currency in the face of such a loss. None were asked for. Instead, the sheriff simply picked up a bucket. "We'll help you douse what's left," he said, his voice low and gravelly. And so they worked, for hours. The men from Redemption, the same town that had spawned the hatred that did this, worked alongside Elias. They formed a silent, grim line from the well, passing buckets of water to quench the last of the embers. They helped him pry splintered boards from the window frames and sweep up the shattered glass. It was a shared, unspoken penance, a tacit admission of their collective guilt. By noon, the fire was out, and the men rode away as quietly as they had come, leaving Elias and Nalin alone once more in the wreckage of their world. The most difficult task remained, the burial of a friend. They chose a spot on a small, windswept hill that overlooked the entire ranch, a place where Silas had often liked to sit and watch the sunset, his pipe smoke curling into the vast sky. Elias took up a shovel and began to dig, refusing any help from Nalin. Each thrust of the spade into the hard, rocky soil was an act of mourning. The scrape of steel on stone was a lament. The thud of earth hitting the growing pile was a final, painful goodbye. He worked with a relentless, mechanical rhythm, his muscles straining, sweat carving clean paths through the grime on his face. It was his penance for not being able to protect the old man, for bringing this trouble to his door. Nalin stood by, a silent, supportive vigil, her presence a source of quiet strength that kept him from shattering. The funeral was as simple and stark as the land itself. There was no preacher, no prayers read from a book. There were only the two of them, the silent mountains and the endless sky. Elias stood over the fresh grave, his hat in his hands, and spoke, his voice rough and breaking. "He was a good man," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "He was loyal, and he was my friend, the only one I had." He stopped, unable to say more, the grief a physical thing, a fist closing around his throat. Nalan stepped forward and placed a small cluster of purple desert flowers she had gathered on the fresh mound of earth. The small spot of color against the raw dirt was a fragile, beautiful testament to a life lived and a friendship honored. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures on a lonely hill, reflecting on the terrible cost of their survival. In the days that followed, the T-Bar Ranch was a place of ghosts. The silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the mournful sound of the wind whistling through the broken windows and the empty doorways of the burned-out barn. They moved through the motions of their daily chores, mending what could be mended, cleaning what could be cleaned. But a deep and abiding melancholy hung over them. They were adrift on an island of grief. They tended to each other's wounds, both the seen and the unseen. Nalan cleaned the cuts and bruises Elias had sustained in his brutal fight with Cain, her touch gentle and soothing. He, in turn, noticed the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, the way she would startle at any sudden, loud noise, her body still coiled tight with the memory of the siege. They began to talk, not of the uncertain future, but of the immediate, traumatic past, a slow and painful attempt to process what had happened. Elias was consumed by a guilt that gnawed at him day and night. "It was my fault," he said one evening, as they sat amidst the quiet devastation of the house. "Silas is dead because of me. I brought this on him." Nalan reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and steady. "No, Elias," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Silas made his own choice. He was a good man who chose to stand by his friend. You cannot take that choice away from him. To do so would be to dishonor his memory." She then confessed her own feelings of guilt, her voice a low whisper. "Sometimes I think, if I had never come here, none of this would have happened. Silas would be alive. Your home would not be in ruins." Elias pulled her close, his good arm wrapping around her with a fierce, protective strength. "Do not ever say that," he said, his voice a low growl of pure conviction. "Your arrival was the only good thing to happen to me in 20 years. The only thing. I would face it all again, 100 times over, to keep you here with me." Their shared grief and trauma, instead of driving them apart, forged their bond into something stronger than steel. They found comfort in the simple, domestic acts of rebuilding their lives. They repaired a broken section of fence together, the rhythmic tap of their hammers a quiet conversation. They cooked meals over the hearth, their hands brushing in the small space, a touch that spoke volumes. At night, they slept in each other's arms, finding solace and a profound sense of safety in their physical closeness. Their passion, once born of desperate defiance, now became a source of quiet healing, a tender reaffirmation of life in the aftermath of so much death. A week after the siege, news came from the world beyond their isolated valley. The circuit judge, a stern but fair man named Hawthorne, made a special trip out to the ranch. He sat with them on their damaged porch and told them that justice, at least the formal, legal kind, had been served. Jedediah Cain, facing the overwhelming evidence of his crimes and the damning testimony of several of the men he had led, had been convicted of incitement to riot and the murder of Silas Croft. He was to be sent to the territorial prison at Yuma, a sun-blasted hellhole from which few men ever returned. Sheriff Blevins, unable to live with his shame and cowardice, had resigned his position and left town. The corrupt power structure of redemption had been broken. In the wake of Cain's downfall, the town's attitude towards them began a slow, grudging shift. Some of the more prejudiced families, the ones who had been Cain's staunchest allies, quietly sold their land and moved away. Others, having seen the terrible injustice that had been done, now kept a respectful distance. A few, like Abernathy, the general store owner, made quiet overtures of peace. One morning, Elias found a large basket of goods on his porch, flour, sugar, coffee, and a bolt of sturdy cloth with a simple, unsigned note that read, "On credit." Full acceptance was a long way off, a destination they might never reach, but the open hostility had been replaced by a wary, hard-won respect. They were no longer just the reclusive rancher and his Apache woman. They were the thorns, the people who had stood their ground against a mob and had, against all odds, won. With the external threat removed, they were faced with a new, daunting question: what to do next? The ranch was nearly destroyed. The barn was gone, the house was a shell, and their small herd of cattle had been scattered. It would be easy, perhaps even sensible, to sell the land for whatever they could get and leave, to start fresh somewhere new where no one knew their story, where the land was not soaked in blood and grief. One afternoon, Elias put the choice to Nayland. He stood with her in the yard, the silence stretching between them. "We could leave," he said, his voice quiet. "Sell this place. Go somewhere else. California, maybe. Oregon. Somewhere green. I will follow you wherever you want to go. Nayland. This life. You do not have to choose this." She did not answer him right away. She turned and began to walk, and he fell into step beside her. She led him up the small hill to the spot where Silas was buried. They stood before the simple mound of earth, the cluster of wildflowers she had placed there now withered and brown. She looked out over the valley, at the harsh but beautiful land spread out below them, the sun turning the distant mesas to gold. "If we run," she said finally, her voice clear and strong, "then Jedediah Kane wins. He takes this land from us after all." She looked from the grave to the ruins of their home. This place was paid for, Elias. It was paid for with Silas's blood. It was paid for with our own. It is more than just dirt and rock now. It is our home. She turned to face him, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering light. "I want to stay. I want to rebuild." Her words filled him with a profound sense of peace and purpose that he had not felt in years. The last of the ghosts that had haunted him seemed to finally recede, banished by the strength of her resolve. They were not defined by what they had lost, but by what they had chosen to become. That evening, in the damaged shell of their home, with the moonlight streaming through the empty window frames, he formally asked her to be his wife. It was a quiet, simple proposal, spoken from the heart. He had no ring of gold or silver to offer her. Instead, he presented her with a simple band he had made himself, 2 thin strips of leather, one dark and one light, braided together into a single, unbreakable circle. Nayland looked at the simple leather ring, then up at his face, her eyes shining with tears. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Elias, I will." They were married a month later. When Judge Hawthorne returned on his circuit, the ceremony took place on their newly repaired porch, witnessed only by the silent, watchful mountains and the vast, endless sky. They spoke simple vows, promising to love, honor, and protect each other for all the days of their lives. The part ends not with a kiss, but with the sound of a hammer. The rebuilding process had begun. Elias and Nayland are seen working side by side in the autumn sun, clearing the charred debris of the old barn. The physical act of reconstruction was a powerful metaphor for their own healing. They were not just rebuilding a structure of wood and nails. They were laying the foundation for a future. The work was hard, the days were long, and their future was still uncertain. But they were together. The mood was one of sober hope and a quiet, unyielding determination. They had survived the fire. Now, from the ashes, they would forge a new life. 8 years passed, an ocean of time that washed away the blood and ash and smoothed the sharp edges of grief into something that could be lived with. The seasons turned, 8 cycles of scorching sun and blessed rain, and with them, the T-Bar Ranch was reborn. Where the blackened skeleton of the old barn had stood, a new, larger one now rose, its unpainted timber smelling of fresh-cut pine and possibility. The ranch house, once a bullet-riddled shell, had been repaired and expanded. A wide porch now wrapped around its front, its posts draped in the determined green vines and bright red blossoms of the trumpet flowers Nayland had planted. The small, weed-choked garden she had first tended was now a lush and thriving plot, a testament to her patient hands. Rows of corn stood tall against the sky, heavy squashes rested on the earth, and bean vines climbed eagerly up their poles. Alongside them grew the native herbs and plants of her childhood, their quiet strength a testament to her own. The entire ranch breathed an air of settled peace and quiet prosperity, a sanctuary built by two pairs of hands and an unbreakable will. The people who had built it had changed as well. Elias, now approaching 50, was a different man. The deep lines of sorrow and suspicion around his eyes had softened into the crow's feet of a man who had learned to smile again. The haunted, weary look that had been his armor for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment that settled deep in his bones. He still moved with a deliberate purpose, but the crushing weight of his past was no longer visible in the set of his shoulders. He walked like a man who was finally, truly, at home. Naylin had blossomed. The wary, resilient girl who had ridden out of the desert had become a confident, serene woman. She was the undisputed heart of the ranch, the calm center around which their world turned. Her presence was felt in every detail, in the brightly woven blankets draped over the chairs, in the neatly organized pantry filled with jars of preserved vegetables, in the gentle way she moved through the home she had fought for and built. But the most significant change, the one that spoke most loudly of their victory over the past, was the sound of laughter. It was a sound that had been absent from the tea-bar for more than a generation, and now it filled the air, carried on the breeze from the yard where their children played. They had a son, a sturdy, curious boy of 6 named Samuel, in honor of the friend who had given his life for them. And they had a daughter, a bright-eyed girl of 4 named Lily, though in quiet moments, Nahlin would call her by her first name, Tu-Ile, a soft whisper that connected their new life to an old one. The children were a perfect, beautiful blend of their parents, both possessing their father's startling gray eyes and their mother's thick, shining black hair. They were the ultimate symbol of hope, living proof that 2 different worlds could come together and create something new and wonderful. Their joyous shouts as they chased a stray chicken were the final, definitive answer to the silence and grief that had once owned this land. They had built more than a ranch. They had built a world. It was a unique sanctuary, governed by their own rules of love and acceptance. Elias taught Samuel how to ride, how to read the clouds for rain, how to be a good steward of the land and the animals that lived on it. The boy's hands, though small, were already learning the feel of leather and rope. But in the evenings, it was Nahlin who would sit with him by the fire, telling him the old Apache stories of the clever coyote and the noble eagle, teaching him the history of a people who saw the sacred in every rock and tree. Lily was her mother's shadow in the garden. She helped to pull weeds and water the seedlings, learning the names of the plants in the 3 languages of her life, the English of her father, the Spanish of the people who had raised her mother, and the Apache of the ancestors she would never know. Their home was a place where both cultures were not just tolerated, but respected and intertwined, a seamless braid of 2 histories. The town of Redemption had evolved as well. With Jedediah Kane's corrupt influence gone, a quieter, more stable community had begun to take root. New families, drawn by the promise of cheap land and a peaceful life, had moved in, while some of the old prejudices undoubtedly lingered beneath the surface, like stubborn roots in hard soil. The thorns were no longer seen as outcasts. They were regarded as fixtures of the landscape, as permanent and resilient as the mesas themselves. They were known for their honesty, the quality of their cattle, and the quiet, unshakable dignity with which they lived their lives. They were respected, if not fully understood. They traded in town like any other family, and Nahlin, who had once been the target of whispers and hateful stares, was now treated with a simple civility that would have been unthinkable years before. They had achieved a hard-won peace with the outside world, primarily by demonstrating, through their quiet success, that they had no need for its approval. One warm spring afternoon, the change was made plain. Elias and Nahlin had taken the children into town for supplies. As they were leaving the general store, a new family, a farmer and his wife who had just settled a plot east of town, stood staring. Their gazes were not hostile, but filled with an open, unsubtle curiosity, taking in Nalen's dark hair and high cheekbones, and the children who were so clearly a mix of two worlds. An awkward silence fell, the kind that often preceded a rude comment or a whispered insult. Before the silence could curdle, Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, bustled out onto the porch. The same man who had once been a pawn in Cain's scheme now beamed at them. "Thorn, good to see you," he said, his voice warm and genuine. He then crouched down to face the children. "And how are Samuel and Lily today?" He produced 2 pieces of hard candy from his apron pocket and handed one to each of them. "Don't you tell your mother you had these before supper." It was a small gesture, a piece of candy, a friendly word, but it was a profound signal of the shift that had occurred. They were not just a rancher and his wife. They were Thorn. They were Samuel and Lily. They were neighbors. They were no longer outcasts. As his own son grew, Elias felt the need to pass down the history of the place, to ensure that the past was remembered not for its pain, but for its lessons. One clear, cool morning, he took Samuel by the hand and walked with him up the hill to Silas's grave. The simple mound of earth was now marked with a headstone carved from a solid piece of cedar. Elias had spent a winter carving it himself. The simple name, Silas Croft, and the words, "A loyal friend." He sat with his son in the tall grass, the wind whispering around them. He told Samuel about the man who was buried there. He did not speak of the gunfight, of the blood, or of the violence of his death. He spoke of his character. "He was a brave man, son," Elias said, his voice quiet and full of reverence. "Bravery is not about not being scared. It is about being scared and doing what is right anyway." And he was loyal. That is a rare and precious thing. He stood by his friends, no matter the cost. He put a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Our home, our family. We have all of this because good people were willing to make sacrifices. We must never forget that." It was a moment of quiet communion, a father passing down the values that had been forged in the crucible of his own life. The true resolution of their long and difficult story came not with a crash of thunder or a dramatic showdown, but in a moment of quiet, perfect peace. It was a late afternoon in the heart of autumn, the air crisp and clean, the sunlight a soft, golden honey poured over the land. The work for the day was done. The whole family was gathered on the wide front porch. Elias sat in his favorite rocking chair, a piece of worn leather tack in his lap, his scarred hands expertly mending a broken strap. Nalen sat on the top step, braiding Lily's long, dark hair, her fingers moving with a gentle, practiced rhythm, beside his father. Samuel sat cross-legged on the floorboards, a small piece of cottonwood in his hand, trying to whittle it into the shape of a bird, mimicking the patient movements of his father. Nalen finished the braid and tied it off with a small leather cord. She looked over at Elias, a soft, loving expression on her face. She reached out and took his hand, the one that held the mending tools, in hers. He stopped his work, the rocking chair falling still. He looked at her. No words were exchanged, none were needed. In that shared gaze, their entire history was present. The terror of a massacre in a long-ago canyon, the lonely, separate years that followed, the difficult, uncertain reunion in the dust and the glare of the sun, the love that was born in the face of hatred, the fire that had almost consumed them, the terrible loss of a friend, and the slow, steady, day-by-day process of building a life from the ashes. It was all there, in the quiet, knowing look that passed between them. He turned her hand over in his and gently touched a simple bracelet she always wore on her wrist. It was made of a single band of polished silver, inlaid with 3 small, sky-blue pieces of turquoise. It had been his gift to her on their first anniversary, a blend of the settler's metal and the native stone. It was a perfect symbol of their union, of the beautiful thing they had created from 2 different worlds. They sat together as the sun dipped below the sharp line of the mesas, painting the vast sky in fiery, brilliant shades of orange, red, and purple, The land that had once been a source of so much hardship, a character of brutal indifference, was now simply their home, serene and beautiful in the evening light. The quiet, happy chatter of their children was the only sound that broke the peaceful silence. Elias put his arm around Naelin's shoulders, and she leaned her head against him, a gesture of perfect trust and contentment. They had found their justice, not in a courtroom or in the cold satisfaction of revenge, but in the simple, profound act of living and loving well. They had endured. They had rebuilt. They had created a family against all odds, a legacy of peace in the heart of the unforgiving West. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in English.